How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Chris Deaver, leadership coach, co-founder of Brave Corps, and the co-author of Brave Together. Last time, Chris took us through the arc of his career from animation to HR to leadership. We talked about how to bring into the fold of co-creative culture building the companies that we don't intuitively associate with creation or creativity. And we also got into the practical side of cultivating co-creative spaces. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off on how different groups around the world have received Chris's approach to culture building.
And Apple was a company too that had, there's a fundamental around secrecy in the culture, and this can happen in any company, is what gets shared, what doesn't, is knowledge power, right? This kind of thing. But we were able to break through all that. And it was powerful because they felt like they could then, let's call it what it is, like really lead, right? In a meaningful way, their teams.
And so do you think you're talking about doing that in other countries? And certainly different countries have different cultures in terms of how people relate to each other and how much they are comfortable speaking up. So I think about, I don't have the experience of working all over the world, but the little I know, I think of two extremes. I think of Israeli culture as very comfortable and encouraging of, what the heck are you talking about? I don't agree with that, and arguing and debating things. And I think about perhaps some Asian cultures where you should defer to the senior people. Do you think inside of us all we have that capacity, or in some cultures is it so deeply driven that it's really tough to get them to release that?
Yeah, I think it's in us. Now, it can show up in different ways. But, like we would talk about it there as like, it's the rock tumbler, right? Debate, healthy debate. It's the rock tumbler of polishing these stones together. And we're all rough stones rolling, right? If we're doing it right. But where it gets polished is with others, right? And we know, the Harvard longitudinal 80-year study of, what is happiness? Like, well, it's relationships, full stop, right? And then what does that mean? Well, it means that we grow and we strengthen each other in relationship. And, you look at like the marriage studies, Gottman Institute, it's like, well, turning towards, right, versus turning against. And that's true of like friendship as much as it is about, teams in organizations, is like, are we having the kind of conversations that, and filling the pool of meaning, right, to build on each other. And part of it is like letting go of ego and putting, building blocks on the table. And there are cultural considerations. I mean, you're not going to, change fundamentally, like, this country, Israel is what you described. It's like, they're going to have a debate, and, it's like, we're going to fight over everything. I'm like, okay, we're going to talk about it, and that's part of the fun. It's part of the intensity. It's part of, but there's all, and on that side of it might also be like, hey, let's be nuanced about this. What makes sense to really go into, right? And what not. And then like in Japan, it might be like, hey, maybe we need to poke the bear a little bit and kind of, or other, kind of Asian countries, and kind of move, create, and it's not for its own sake. It's like, well, we want the quality, to be as high as it can be. And it's also not to just like artificially do this, right? Or to try to be extroverts, everybody. I've tended more towards being introverted. I've turned into more of an ambivert now, because of these principles. You're like, well, I see where things converge, and when it makes it, meaningful and makes, not just companies, but any organization, again, I think successful takes, and that's the idea, right? The book, it says, okay, we all reside in this baseline of fear, conscious, subconscious. This could be day to day. There's some worry about whatever thing, financial, health related, whatever's in front of us. And we break out of that by being brave and, hustle, hacks, optimization, work harder, work smarter. But there's limitations to that. And we know this intuitively as human beings. And that's why I think, to answer your question, everybody knows this intuitively, right? Like, in a marriage, I think, not to get political, but I think this is a funny anecdote I heard. they asked somebody in an interview was asking Ben Shapiro. They said, you say all the time, like, facts don't care about your feelings. They said, how's that working in your marriage? And he goes, I don't say that to my wife. And you're like,
Right.
oh, they're like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, but we have this dynamic in whether it's inside of ourselves, our minds and our hearts. And, this happens, I think in marriage, it's like, and it could be somebody's leaning in more to the mind versus more to the heart. And I think a lot of organizations have leaned in very heavy into the mind side of things. And we're starting to see more and more. I mean, look at like Brene Brown's work. It's very heart related.
Right.
And so there's the answer, I think, isn't just go extreme on the heart, but I think it's actually a convergence and synthesis of both.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be tethered in principles. But it is both. Like it is. I mean, in the book we say, shared wisdom is the mind. That's the best of, and then the heart is deep empathy is the best of that. And then if it's powered by principles, it could say the spirit that tethers the mind and heart. It's the best of, right? You're co-creating. You're doing it right.
So talk more about what you mean by being tethered in principles.
Yeah. So I'm an admitted student of Stephen Covey. The original, he was a mentor of mine, and I've always respected his work. And I feel like, I would say there's an absence. There's been less of a focus on principles. And yet, I would say in culture, as it relates to culture, and yet when we talk about products or the best kinds of products, and let's say, for example, SpaceX, they want to launch a rocket, but they also want to build a self-landing rocket, right? This is very hard to do. It's actually impossible at the time. They didn't know how to do it. So how do you go about something like that? Well, they had to break down, and Elon Musk talks about this, finding the first principles, right? And the best engineers do this. They say, well, there's gravity involved, right? There's a certain types of substances or materials you have to pull together to do this. There's, we're going to deal with like what kind of propulsion you need, like all these elements. But there's the core first principles that matter the most. And those are questions on an engineering front they've asked, but most leaders or teams haven't asked the question about their leadership or the team or the culture, and what are the first principles that should be built on. And again, going back to humanity and what's timeless and what's universal, we know it's the things we've been talking about: compassion, wisdom, humility, sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they had an interview with Jensen Huang, head of NVIDIA, and I think probably most people at Stanford thought, well, he's going to tell us about all the success he's had and how great it is, and he's like sitting there talking about washing toilets, and the worst jobs he's ever had, and he's likening it to his experience now, and he says to that class of Stanford, he's like, most of you haven't suffered. He goes, I hope for you that you'll suffer, in the sense of joy, because the joy that comes from when you're doing it for a reason, when there's it's essentially sacrifice, what he's describing. And that's their business model. Like, they're doing impossible things. By the way, it's having a huge impact in the world. But this is leadership, and this is, culture is being tethered to timeless principles, or Tim Cook, where he sits in a meeting and, at a conference in Utah, and they ask him, well, what's Apple like in, 1 to 10 years? And he said, I don't think about Apple in 1 to 10 years. He goes, I think about Apple in 100 years or 1,000 years. And who does that, right? Well, but if you do, what it does is it forces your consciousness to say, hey, the horizon and timeline goes way beyond this quarter. And by the way, those aren't the best decisions to be making based on a quarter, or even a year. It could be because you have a product launch, but what matters the most is what is the perpetual motion we're creating in our people, to create the best products and the best services. And if you ask these people, these that have created the best cultures, the best companies, best brands that we admire, they all say, what's the best product you created, your favorite product? They always say it's the culture.
Yeah. I remember, I think I could be wrong about who wrote this. I think it was Jim Collins in one of his books that talked about how the most successful companies, it wasn't so much about the product or the service, but they had built teams of people who were creative enough, who whatever problems would come up, okay, we got a great team, we'll figure out what to do about that, versus having a strategy that says, instead of contingency planning around, well, what if this happens or that happens? The contingency planning, in a sense, being, let's build a fantastic team of people that are able to respond to whatever might happen in the future. I think it was Collins that talked about that.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like, and the hard part is it feels counterintuitive in the sense that we want to have certainty. Like we love having certainty, right? Which,
Here's
by the way,
strategy. This is what we're going to
do. Yeah. Which, by the way, isn't working out very well for us right now, for anybody, right? It's like the whole certainty thing is out the window. I think we've either come to the conclusion or it's been thrust upon us that life is just full of singularities. It's disruptive, right? Post-COVID, especially, it's like, and, talking geopolitically, not getting into that, but like, it's just constant disruption. Every day can feel like not just a new chapter, but like a new book, a new, like it's a new library altogether. It's like, what just happened, right? Like the world's changed again and the world keeps changing. I don't know that that's going away for the next decade. And so, if everything starts to look like a singularity, then, we can't be running on rules-based approaches. And to your point, it's like, hey, what better way than if we know it's going to be, because like, even if you look at AI, right, it's like, okay. And, a lot of leaders have gone into this business of like, they're taking the extreme of like, okay, this means cut tons of people. You're like, well, does it actually mean that? I'm not sure. Right. And the people I talk to that I think the smart ones are saying essentially what you just said, which is, let's not be so quick to that. How do we think about teams that are innovating and continue to build a future that has a collective sense? Yes, they're co-creating with AI because, but they're producing the highest quality original solutions together. And then then you supplement that with what technology can do. That's always been true though. I mean, if we look at like, Google or the advent of any technology that's come to fruition, it's like, well, that was at its best. It was a team of people creating something pretty amazing. And that's going to continue to be true. Yeah.
So just shifting gears a little bit, but not entirely. Your company's called Bravecore. You talk about bravery a lot. You referred to it a little bit ago when you were talking about the challenges that we face. So tell me more about this whole theme that you have around, I mean, obviously it's a big theme. It's the name of your company, it's the name of your book. Talk to me more about this idea of bravery. Why is that such a big deal?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I think, I would say, look, we, more than ever, I think given the timing we're in right now, as far as the world and all that, there's never been a time more important for people to be able to be brave. And I think the thing about being brave is, Maya Angelou said that all the other characteristics are that bravery is the best expression of them, because it takes being brave to express all of those other attributes, right? You have to be brave to be humble. You have to be brave to have compassion. And so, what does the future look like for leaders and for, the best leaders, the best teams? Well, it's definitely brave, because it takes being brave to lean in and, try to figure out the nuanced answers, right? It's like, hey, I'm not going to just pull this lever. And by the way, I've had conversations with people in various companies that will remain unnamed, but they did massive layoffs. And I've talked to senior leaders in those companies and they've said it was a terrible idea, it turns out. And why was it a terrible idea? It's like, well, not only does it feel schizophrenic because it's jumping from one extreme to the other, and forget the fact that like everybody in the company now is wondering if they're next, right? So that's not very good for culture. But third to that is they haven't really positioned themselves in the sense that we're saying, right? Which is, let's be, say nuanced, but there's a synthesis here. And our purpose, what is our purpose as a company? Well, our purpose is, I'd say it's to exist in the future, but it's to continue to bring and enrich people's lives in the future and in a higher and higher level. And if that's true, then you're going to be leaning into, ways that, and it takes bravery to do this, because the risk is, well, maybe you don't get this, don't squeeze that margin out of this person or that those clients or this or whatever, or there's some opportunity that looks good, but it's actually an illusion, or it's just not as good as what that future that is the beautiful future, the promised land. But it's harder, it's harder. And this is why, like, some people would say, well, why don't companies copy these other companies? It's like, well, it's really hard. It's
Mm-hmm.
really hard. And besides being hard in the sense of like, it's hard to build, it's hard in the sense of, wrestling with our own human nature, to, push off, call it the natural man, in the propensity for us to want to have the easy answers, right? Or to get distracted and to choose those timeless principles. But we know that, like, if you choose timeless principles and you're rooted in those, well, that creates timeless results, right? Input equals output. So if we're choosing the short, distraction, the quick stuff, well, that's going to create more quick stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and, on and on and on.
Right.
And so, I mean, law of the harvest, all the stuff we know, but is, know versus do. That's,
Mm-hmm.
it can be, and then do consistently,
Right.
and then build it into not just our habits personally, but our patterns with others.
Right.
That's the power. Yeah.
Many years ago, I had, there's a friend of mine who was teaching a leadership course, and I used to once a year come in and do a guest lecture day for him. And I remember one of the days that I went, I still have this document that I wrote. This goes back like 20 years ago. And I wrote a document of just kind of leadership principles, things that, these are for college students to think about leadership. And one of the things that I wrote, and I think about this often, is that the best leaders, the way I wrote it back then, was make decisions within a philosophical framework. And what I meant by that is really what you're saying, that there's a philosophy of how we think about these kinds of things. Timeless philosophy, we can call it, but there is a philosophy. There's a way that we think about this. And good leaders, in my experience, make decisions in a way that's consistent with that philosophy, which gives people consistency and predict. I know what to expect of you as a leader because of these are, to use your phrase, these are the timeless principles under which we operate. And if I know that that's how you operate, I think it makes it easier for me as a team member to work. I'm not wondering which Chris is showing up today.
Yeah.
Is it the schizophrenic one that's going in one direction, or is it the other? Or who do I got here?
Absolutely. Well, and the hard part is it's leaders have to embody this, and the teams have to embody, because earlier we were talking about Jim Collins. I love his work, and and the philosophy is built to last. What gets built to last, right? These companies. Now the irony is, like, no matter what time, what point in time you do, you have companies that are listed there that they turns out they didn't last, right? Some of them died, but the fundamentals that we're talking about were there. It was a matter of people or leaders diverging from those principles.
Yes.
Right. And then they weren't embodying those. And, this can be true of any company, right? So it's all because there's no guarantee. So what culture, this kind of gets us, I mean, speaking philosophically, is like, well, what is culture? And we could be talking about culture in the context of business or culture in general. And it really is those embodied attributes that are observable. And, the interesting thing about this is, again, in the best companies, they don't even have mission statements on the wall. You see the people and you observe, and then you notice and you realize what the culture is. And it gets talked about, there's things that get reinforced, but it's not by sitting in a meeting and, repeating the word trust or communication, 1,000 times. It's that there's those principles, like you mentioned, that they're just lived and they're stood by, and especially in the toughest moments, right? Where the pressure's on and we're saying, what are they going to do? Right. And maybe there's money on the line. And sometimes these are like, severe cases where it's like, this is a question of integrity and it all hits the fan. And that's, there's big cases that are widely publicized about that, but there's also the more nuanced ones, which are, the good to great ones, which is like, hey, this is the best quality. Like, what's the best, versus, what could otherwise be. And that's hard. I think that might be harder too.
Well, and it's most of our audience members know that in the work that we do with people and that I write about, it's all about describing for a company. So what are those principles that we live by? We happen to call them, consistent with your language, we call them fundamentals. These are the fundamentals in which we operate. And one of the things I was doing a talk yesterday. I was in North Carolina and I was doing a talk, and somebody came up to me and they were asking me about one of their principles was to do the right thing. And he was frustrated a little bit in that he couldn't find a way to articulate that in a way that was clear enough that it answered everybody's questions. And I said to him, you never will. And that the beauty of it is it's the discussion around it. It's you want people to be in a meeting or in a conversation saying, I know that one of our principles here is to do the right thing. I'm not sure what the right thing is in this moment. Let's talk about that. Should I do this? When would we do this? How do we make that decision? To me, at least, it's in those conversations that principle comes. We have the principle. We know what the principle is, but it's in those conversations that we ask ourselves, how does that apply in this situation right now? We know we want to live to that principle, but it's never going to be a simple black and white answer. And that's the beauty of stating those principles and teaching them and bringing them into life every day.
Yeah, you're right. And that's so right. And to wrestle with it, right? To be willing to wrestle with it. I
think wrestle is a good word there because they're not easy.
Yeah. And it may mean unpacking some things. And, sometimes it's, hey, why do we make that decision, right? And being willing to stay in that conversation. I was talking to a good friend about this, and we're talking about how families sometimes can grow apart, as in siblings or whatever. And sometimes there's and I think in the world today, it's so polarized, right? There's maybe lots of reasons, but I think the difference maker too, and if we're talking about in family as well as an organization, and I don't know, those things don't always go in parallel, but the thing that I think is common is in those moments of wrestle, in those moments of conflict or challenge, that they can stay in it, right? And try to work through and figure out and stick to the principles, right? Because the principles are the things that are going to get us through the storms properly, or at least where we want to be on the other end, right? The other side, as hard as that may be.
We have quite a few clients of ours who I remember saying as they came out of the pandemic that their fundamentals, as we call them, got them through the pandemic. When times got tough, they leaned on their principles. And they said, what are the principles under which we operate? And it led them through that.
Yeah,
so I'm going to ask you one other question and then sort of tie this together. So I'm curious, this is a different direction than we've gone, but I'm curious from your perspective, there's a lot of work out there that's been done about the difference in the generations in the workforce. And clearly different generations have been brought up under different circumstances, and it influences how they think. And so I'm curious from your perspective, how do different generations in the workforce relate to the work that you're doing? Is it more relevant in some generations than others, or some have a greater propensity to that work? How do the generations influence that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're seeing is this wave of co-creation is very enticing, right? We talk about wants and needs. And I think people, particularly, Gen Y, Millennial, Gen X, or Gen Z, sorry, they want this collective, collaborative approach to work that they haven't been finding as much, or that respects their kind of creative propensity. And what's amounted in that. So then we see on the extreme, the bad boss stuff, the toxic boss or toxic work cultures. But what really is happening is they want it to be different, and they want it to accommodate or to position, some of the permission to express, like we've talked about. And it's not just, I don't think it's about just individuality. I honestly believe that that's part of it. But the other part of the story is they want to make really great things. But that's also true of all of us. So that's one of those fundamentals where I don't know if it was boomers or Gen X that said, hey, work-life balance, right? And suddenly everybody's like, work-life balance, we all need it, And so these are ripple effect things. So the creative propensity, the co-creation, the being brave together with others, I think everybody wants this. And we're seeing definitely, a lot of energy in, those other generations. But, we're also at a time, there's a book called The Fourth Turning that I love that, talks about generations, and it talks about 80 to 100 year cycles over history, and then particularly in our country. And it talks about how we're in this phase of crisis, which is the last phase before rebirth. And, that's the other thing, is we're in a time of, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of concerns and worries and challenges. And so, but there's this undercurrent of people wanting to come together and work together, differently and be brave and do the kind of the best work of their lives in cultures that they love. And so I think, it's incumbent upon leaders, and this is true of any generation. I think, for the incumbents, boomers, Gen X, or Gen Y coming into roles, it's like, hey, if you're leaning into that future, and it's not like, hey, hand over the reins, because that's the other extreme. It's like, that doesn't make sense. It's like, let's find that synthesis, because in those best places, that's the shared experience. The experience is, it's not just self-made, it's shared, and it's shared in such a way where you have that shared flow. You feel like, hey, I'm part of something. I'm helping to build it. Right.
Well, it's what's interesting, as I think about what you're saying, Chris, is that I think about I guess it'd be Gen Z, the youngest in the workforce. And it's interesting that even outside of just work, it seems that generation has a much greater comfort with sharing in general and being collaborative. And so whether it's shared living arrangements, whether it's shared cars, I don't need to have a car. I'll just borrow somebody else's. Whereas, baby boomers, shoot, we think, I want my own stuff. And so there's a general, I think, point of view where it's more of a community-minded way of thinking than I would say generations before had, which would seem to me, as I think about that, I hadn't thought of it this way before, but would seem to lend itself more to a co-creation kind of way of thinking, because they're already more collaborative by nature in how they approach life in the world versus individualistic.
And then there's an overlap in that and this is where the generations kind of can rely on each other's strengths, right? Where I think there's wisdom, right? And definitely experience from, boomer generation, Gen X, and, Z and Y coming in and saying, hey, we want this to be a collective shared experience. And we're like, well, if there's resistance to that, it doesn't help. But by the way, it's like, well, they're right? If we amplify those strengths, we also got to amplify the strengths of, the wisdom and the expertise and perspective that's there. And by doing that, I look at it like, what better way than to have this kind of, it's like a shared generation. It's like this generation brave. We're all dealing with the same kinds of challenges, and what better way to do this than together,
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, Chris, this has been an amazing conversation, very insightful, very philosophical, which I always love. I was a philosophy major in college, by the way. So
nice.
Those are my kinds of conversations, and I always appreciate that. So if audience members wanted to learn more about your work specifically, and what you do and read some of your material, tell me, where do people find you? What would be the best resources to learn more about your work? Yeah,
absolutely. So, our website is bravecore.co. It's where you can get resources, find artifacts and other things. We also have the book Brave Together. It's on Amazon. We have an audiobook version. We just had a video book version that just came out. So speaking of generations, if that's your thing, you want, it's like 30 minutes of the book compressed down to, a lot of visual. So that's there. And, I'm on LinkedIn too. So open to, connecting and, excited, for people to, just embrace the notion of being brave and whatever that means for you in your life, to do that together with others.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate you joining us on Culture Architects. It's been a fascinating conversation. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.
And that's all for this episode of Culture Architects with my fellow culture architect, Chris Deaver, leadership coach, co-founder of Bravecore, and the co-author of Brave Together. Folks, if you've been enjoying what we do on this show, make sure you subscribe. And that way, anytime new episodes are released, you'll get it right away. If you have a minute, I'd also love it if you left us a review. And that way, more culture fans like you can discover the show. And if you want to learn more about building a high-performing culture in your organization, check us out at CultureWise.com. See you next time.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.